A racist cop arrests a black boy outside a luxury mall, convinced he's up to no good. The boy stays calm despite the humiliation, until he drops a bombshell. "My dad is your boss." The officer freezes, his confidence shattered. But the nightmare is only beginning. The boy's father is the newly appointed police commissioner, a man with a reputation for justice and zero tolerance for prejudice. As the officer's world spirals out of control, secrets from his past resurface, and the truth threatens to destroy his career and his sense of self. Can one arrest unravel an entire life? And what happens when the tables turn and redemption comes with a cost? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the pristine streets of Millbrook Heights, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched out before cookie-cutter houses. Officer Frank Marshall sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched shoppers come and go from the newly built Riverside Mall, its glass facade gleaming in the late afternoon light. 23 years on the force had taught Frank to trust his instincts. He'd earned his reputation as a by-the-book officer who kept the peace in this affluent suburb. The sight of a young black 10-year-old kid approaching the mall's main entrance alone, wearing a backpack, immediately caught his attention. Frank straightened in his seat, his eyes narrowing. The boy walked with purpose, head held high, showing none of the usual hesitation he'd expect from someone up to no good. Still, something didn't sit right with him. He'd seen too many incidents at this mall, and his gut told him to investigate. He pulled his cruiser into a closer parking spot and stepped out, adjusting his belt as he walked briskly toward the entrance. The boy was just about to push through the glass doors when Frank called out, "Hold up there, son." Isaiah Carter turned, his expression shifting from surprise to wariness as he spotted the officer's uniform. "Yes, sir?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "Mind if I ask what brings you to the mall today?" Frank positioned himself between Isaiah and the entrance, noting how the boy's fingers tightened around his backpack strap. "I'm meeting my friends at the food court," Isaiah replied, maintaining eye contact. "Is there a problem, officer?" Frank gestured to the backpack. "That's quite a large bag for just meeting friends. Mind showing me what's inside?" A small crowd of shoppers had begun to gather, some pretending not to stare while others openly watched the scene unfold. 2 mall security guards drifted closer, their walkie-talkies crackling with static. Isaiah's jaw clenched, but his voice remained controlled. "Sir, I don't mean any disrespect, but I don't think I've done anything wrong. I'm just trying to meet my friends." "Listen, son," Frank said, his tone hardening. "This is a simple request. If you've got nothing to hide—" "I'm not your son," Isaiah interrupted, his words quiet but firm. "My name is Isaiah Carter. You're stopping me because I'm black, aren't you?" Frank felt heat rise to his face as whispers rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. "Now hold on just a minute." "No, sir," Isaiah continued, his young voice carrying across the suddenly silent entrance. "I know my rights. You have no probable cause to search my bag. I haven't done anything suspicious except exist in this space, and I'm not going anywhere until you tell me exactly what made you single me out." The mall security guards exchanged uncomfortable glances. A woman in the crowd had her phone out, recording the interaction. Frank's collar felt tight as he realized the situation was slipping out of his control. "You're causing a disturbance," Frank said, trying to regain authority in his voice. "I was walking into a public place," Isaiah responded. "You're the one who stopped me. You're the one causing a disturbance, and I think we both know why." Frank's hand instinctively moved to rest on his belt, and he saw several people in the crowd tense up. Isaiah noticed too, but instead of backing down, he squared his shoulders and looked Frank directly in the eyes. "Are you going to call my father?" Isaiah asked, "or should I?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Frank found himself at a crossroads he'd never expected to face on what had started as a routine patrol. Frank's jaw tightened as he reached for Isaiah's backpack. "Hand it over," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd wielded for over 2 decades. The crowd around them had grown larger, their murmurs of disapproval becoming more audible with each passing moment. Isaiah's eyes glistened with unshed tears of frustration, but he held himself tall as he slowly removed his backpack. "This isn't right," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "You know this isn't right." The mall security guards shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Frank and the growing number of phone cameras recording the scene. One of them, a younger man with a nervous expression, took a half-step forward before his partner placed a restraining hand on his arm. Frank unzipped the backpack with deliberate slowness, aware of the dozens of eyes watching his every move. Inside, he found exactly what any 10-year-old might carry: a math textbook, a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic, a water bottle, and a wrinkled permission slip for an upcoming school field trip. "See?" Isaiah said quietly, his cheeks burning with embarrassment as Frank pulled out each item and placed them on the gleaming mall floor. "Just like I told you. Nothing suspicious." But Frank wasn't finished. He turned the backpack inside out, checking every pocket and compartment. The crowd's disapproving whispers grew louder. A woman in a business suit shook her head and muttered, "This is disgraceful." Someone else called out, "Leave the kid alone." "Sir?" Isaiah tried again, his voice stronger now despite the tremor in his hands. "My father is a respected member of this community. He works with the police department. If you'd just call him—" "Stand against the wall," Frank interrupted, pointing to the mall's entrance. His heart was racing now, and somewhere in the back of his mind a small voice was telling him he'd gone too far. But he couldn't back down now, not with all these people watching. "I said stand against the wall." Isaiah complied, placing his hands flat against the cool glass of the mall entrance. His reflection showed a face trying hard to maintain composure, but his lower lip quivered slightly. "Everyone's watching," he said softly, more to himself than to Frank. "Everyone can see what's happening." The mall security guards exchanged worried glances. The older one finally spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Officer Marshall, maybe we should—" "This is a police matter now," Frank cut him off, his hand resting on his belt. "This young man is acting suspicious and uncooperative." A teenager in the crowd shouted, "The only one suspicious here is you, officer." Frank's face flushed red as he heard phones clicking and voices rising in anger. He could feel the situation spiraling out of his control, but something inside him wouldn't let him stop. Pride, fear, or maybe just plain stubbornness kept him moving forward. "I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back," he said to Isaiah, reaching for his handcuffs. Isaiah's shoulders tensed, but he didn't move. "My father always told me that if I was ever in trouble with the police, I should stay calm and remember that the truth would come out," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent crowd. "He said there are good officers and bad officers, but in the end, the camera doesn't lie. And there are a lot of cameras here today. Officer Marshall." The metal of the handcuffs felt unusually heavy in Frank's hands as he stepped closer to Isaiah, the eyes of the crowd burning into his back like accusatory spotlights. The police station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as Frank led Isaiah through the entrance, one hand firmly gripping the boy's arm. Other officers looked up from their desks, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern at the sight of a handcuffed 10-year-old being brought in. "Sit here," Frank commanded, directing Isaiah to a hard plastic chair next to his desk. His hands shook slightly as he began filling out the arrest paperwork, the events at the mall playing over and over in his mind. Isaiah sat perfectly straight, his chin held high despite the tears that had dried on his cheeks. Several officers whispered among themselves, throwing questioning glances in Frank's direction. One of them, Officer Rodriguez, approached Frank's desk with a concerned frown. "Everything okay here, Marshall?" Rodriguez asked, his eyes darting between Frank and Isaiah. "Just processing an arrest," Frank replied tersely, not looking up from his paperwork. "Suspicious behavior at the mall. Possible shoplifting attempt." Isaiah let out a small, bitter laugh that made Frank's pen pause mid-sentence. "Suspicious behavior," the boy repeated quietly. "Is that what we're calling it?" Frank's jaw clenched as he continued writing. The clicking of his keyboard seemed unnaturally loud in the growing silence of the station. More officers had stopped their work to watch the scene unfold. "You know," Isaiah said, his voice steady despite his trembling hands, "my dad always told me that some people see what they want to see, that sometimes their minds are already made up before they even look at the facts. Frank's typing slowed, but he didn't respond. He pulled up the arrest form on his computer screen, trying to focus on the task at hand. He also told me, Isaiah continued, that the hardest part of his job isn't dealing with the bad guys. It's dealing with officers who forget why they put on the badge in the first place. Frank's fingers froze over the keyboard. Something about the way Isaiah spoke made his stomach twist uncomfortably. "You're going to regret this," Isaiah said softly, looking directly at Frank for the first time since entering the station. "My dad is your boss." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. His head snapped up, meeting Isaiah's unwavering gaze. "What did you say?" "Marcus Carter," Isaiah said clearly, making sure every officer in earshot could hear him. "The new police captain. He's my father." Frank's face drained of color as the implications sank in. He'd heard about the new captain starting next week, but he hadn't made the connection. His mind raced back to the mall, to the phones recording his every move, to Isaiah's calm insistence about calling his father. Officer Rodriguez inhaled sharply. "Marshal," he said quietly, "Captain Carter's appointment was in last week's bulletin. Did you not?" Frank's hands hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed. The arrest form on his screen suddenly seemed to mock him. He could feel the stares of his fellow officers boring into him, could hear their whispered conversations. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down completely. "You could be lying," he said to Isaiah, but his voice lacked conviction. "You could call and check," Isaiah replied calmly. "But you won't, will you? Because deep down, you already know it's true, and you're starting to realize exactly what you've done today." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Frank sat frozen at his desk, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. The handcuffs on Isaiah's wrists gleamed accusingly under the harsh lighting, and Frank could feel his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. In a few minutes, the shrill ring of the station's phone cut through the tense silence. Frank's superior, Sergeant Wilson, answered it, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to barely concealed alarm. "Yes, Commissioner Carter, I understand completely, sir," Wilson's voice carried across the quiet room. "No, sir, I had no idea. Yes, of course, right away." Every officer in the room watched as Wilson hung up the phone and strode purposefully toward Frank's desk. His face was tight with controlled anger. "Marshal," Wilson barked, "remove those cuffs now." Frank's hands trembled slightly as he fumbled with his keys. "Sir, I was just following protocol." "Protocol?" Wilson's voice was sharp enough to make several officers flinch. "Commissioner Carter is on his way here right now. His 10-year-old son is sitting at your desk in handcuffs. Does that sound like proper protocol to you?" Isaiah remained perfectly still as Frank removed the handcuffs, his wrists showing slight red marks where the metal had pressed against his skin. The boy rubbed them gently, but said nothing, his silence more damning than any words could have been. The station doors burst open exactly 7 minutes later. Marcus Carter's presence filled the room immediately, his tall frame carrying an authority that had nothing to do with his uniform. His eyes locked onto his son first, scanning for any signs of injury. "Isaiah," Marcus called out, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad," Isaiah responded, standing up straight. "Just like we talked about, right? Stay calm, stay focused." A flicker of pride crossed Marcus's face before his expression hardened again. He turned to Frank, who had unconsciously taken a step backward. "Officer Marshall," Marcus said, his voice carrying a chill that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. "My office. Now." "Sir," Frank started, "I can explain." That wasn't a request. Marcus's words cut through Frank's protest like a knife through butter. He turned to Wilson. "Sergeant, I'll need to borrow your office for this conversation." "Of course, Commissioner," Wilson replied quickly. "Take all the time you need." Marcus placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder. "Son, wait here with Sergeant Wilson. This won't take long." Isaiah nodded, taking a seat by Wilson's desk. The other officers pretended to focus on their work, but their attention remained fixed on the unfolding drama. Frank followed Marcus toward the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. The commissioner's broad shoulders were rigid with contained anger, his footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor like countdown beats to Frank's impending reckoning. As they reached the office door, Marcus paused, turning to face Frank with an expression that made the veteran officer feel like a rookie all over again. "After you, Officer Marshall." Frank stepped into the office, his throat dry and his palms sweating. The gentle click of the door closing behind them sounded like the final nail in the coffin of his career. Marcus Carter stood between Frank and the door, his presence somehow making the small office feel even smaller. "Sit down, Officer Marshall," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying the weight of years of authority. "We need to have a very serious conversation about what happened today." Frank lowered himself into the chair across from the desk, acutely aware that his next few words could determine the course of his entire future. The afternoon sun streaming through the office windows cast Marcus's shadow long across the floor, reaching toward Frank like an accusing finger. Marcus Carter stood behind the desk, his hands planted firmly on its surface as he leaned forward slightly. The late afternoon light cast deep shadows across his face, making his expression even more imposing. "Do you understand what could happen here, Marshall?" Marcus's voice was controlled, but carried an undercurrent of barely contained anger. "My son, a 10-year-old boy, was profiled, detained, and handcuffed in front of dozens of witnesses. How do you think that's going to look?" Frank shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his collar suddenly feeling too tight. "Sir, I was following standard procedure for suspicious." "Suspicious?" Marcus cut him off sharply. "What exactly was suspicious about a young man walking into a mall with a backpack, besides the obvious factor you and I both know influenced your decision?" The words hung heavy in the air between them, Frank's face flushed with a mix of shame and defensiveness. "Commissioner, I would have stopped any—" "Don't." Marcus raised his hand, silencing Frank mid-sentence. "Don't insult both of us by finishing that statement." He moved around the desk, sitting on its edge closer to Frank. "The mall's security cameras caught everything. The way you approached him, the unnecessary search, the humiliation in front of all those people. Do you know what my son was doing at the mall?" Frank shook his head silently. "He was buying my birthday present," Marcus said quietly, the words landing like lead weights. "He'd been saving his allowance for months, wanted to surprise me." Frank's stomach twisted with guilt. He stared at his hands, unable to meet his superior's gaze. "I could suspend you," Marcus continued. "Could even push for more serious consequences given the circumstances. The media would love this story. Commissioner's son racially profiled by veteran officer." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But that wouldn't solve anything, would it?" Frank looked up, confusion mixing with the anxiety on his face. "Instead, I'm going to give you a choice," Marcus said, standing up straight. "For the next 6 weeks, you'll shadow me in various community programs. Youth centers, neighborhood watch meetings, family support services, all of it. You'll work directly with the people you've spent your career viewing through a lens of suspicion. Or—" He let the word hang there. "Or?" Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Or you can face an official investigation into today's incident, with all the consequences that might bring." Marcus's tone was matter of fact, not threatening. Frank's mind raced through the implications. 6 weeks of community service would be humiliating, especially under the commissioner's direct supervision. But an investigation could end his career, destroy his pension, everything he'd worked for. "I need your answer now, Marshall," Marcus said firmly. "Which will it be?" Frank swallowed hard, his pride warring with his pragmatism. "The community programs, sir," he finally managed. "Good choice." Marcus nodded. "You'll start tomorrow. I run a youth basketball program at the community center on Maple Street. Be there at 4 p.m. sharp." He moved back behind his desk, sitting down. "And Marshall?" "Yes, sir?" "This is your one chance, don't waste it." Marcus's eyes held Frank's gaze steadily. "I believe people can change, but they have to want to. Show me you want to." Frank nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of both the warning and the opportunity. "Yes, sir. I understand." "We'll see," Marcus replied, his expression unreadable. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. Don't be late. The Carter house was quiet when Marcus pulled into the driveway that evening. The porch light cast a soft glow across the well-maintained lawn, but the tension from earlier still hung heavy in the air. As he entered, he found Isaiah sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing the same clothes from the mall incident, his untouched dinner growing cold. "Son," Marcus started, his voice gentle. "We should talk about what happened today." Isaiah didn't look up from the table. "Now you want to talk?" His voice was tight with emotion. "Where was all this talking when that officer was dragging me through the mall like a criminal?" Marcus pulled out a chair and sat down across from his son. "Isaiah, I handled the situation the best way The best way?" Isaiah's head snapped up, his eyes glistening with angry tears. "You let him walk away with a slap on the wrist. Do you know how many people saw me getting searched? How many phones were recording? My friend's parents were there, Dad." Marcus leaned forward, trying to bridge the growing gap between them. "I know you're hurt, and you have every right to be, but suspending or firing Officer Marshall wouldn't solve the bigger problem. No, the bigger problem is that my own father cares more about some racist cop's redemption story than his son's dignity." Isaiah pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You're always talking about making changes in the community, but when it's your own son being humiliated, suddenly it's all about second chances?" The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He watched as his son paced the kitchen, years of frustration finally boiling over. "Every time something like this happens, you play the peaceful mediator," Isaiah continued, his voice cracking. "But I'm tired of being your teaching moment, Dad. I'm tired of being the bigger person while guys like Marshall get to learn and grow from their mistakes." Marcus stood up slowly. "Isaiah, listen to me. What happened today was wrong, completely wrong. But as commissioner..." "As commissioner?" Isaiah interrupted, throwing his hands up. "What about as my father? Where was that guy today?" The kitchen fell silent except for Isaiah's ragged breathing. Marcus felt the weight of his son's words pressing down on his shoulders. He'd spent so many years trying to balance being a leader in the community with being a father, and now it felt like both roles were slipping through his fingers. "You're right," Marcus finally said, his voice heavy with realization. "I should have done more today, not as the commissioner, but as your dad. I was so focused on the bigger picture that I forgot the most important picture of all, you." Isaiah's shoulders slumped slightly, some of the anger giving way to hurt. "I just needed you to stand up for me, Dad, to show everyone that what happened wasn't okay. Instead, you took him into your office and gave him a chance to make things right? What about making things right with me?" Marcus moved closer to his son, fighting the urge to reach out, knowing Isaiah wasn't ready for that yet. "I promise you, this isn't just about Officer Marshall's redemption. This is about making sure what happened to you never happens to another kid. But you're right. I should have thought about how my decision would affect you first." "It's always about the greater good with you," Isaiah said quietly, wrapping his arms around himself. "But sometimes, Dad, I just need you to be my father first and the commissioner second." Marcus stood there, watching his son's pain and feeling the distance between them more acutely than ever. Everything he'd worked for, the position, the respect, the ability to make change, suddenly felt hollow in the face of his son's broken trust. The morning sun cast long shadows across the police station parking lot as Frank Marshall waited nervously by his patrol car. He tugged at his collar, uncomfortable in the casual polo shirt Marcus had insisted he wear instead of his uniform. When the commissioner's car pulled up, Frank straightened his posture, trying to mask his unease. "Good morning, Officer Marshall," Marcus said, his tone professional but cool. "Ready to start your community service?" Frank nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." The words felt strange in his mouth, especially knowing where they were headed. The drive to the youth center was silent, broken only by Marcus's occasional directions. Frank stared out the window, watching as the familiar streets of his patrol route took on a different character in the morning light. Children walked to school, parents hurried to work, and the world seemed to move at a gentler pace than during his usual night shifts. When they arrived at the Riverside Youth Center, Frank's stomach tightened. The building was bright and welcoming, with colorful murals decorating its walls, but to Frank, it felt like walking into enemy territory. "Remember," Marcus said as they approached the entrance, "you're here to learn and listen, not to police." Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Boys gathered around pool tables, younger kids worked on art projects, and the sound of laughter echoed through the halls. Frank noticed how the chatter dimmed slightly as they walked in, how some kids whispered and pointed in his direction. In the main recreation room, Frank spotted Isaiah sitting with a group of friends. The boy's face hardened when he saw Frank, and he deliberately turned away, focusing intently on a game of cards. "Everyone," Marcus called out, his voice commanding attention without being harsh. "This is Officer Marshall. He'll be joining us for the next few weeks to learn more about our community programs." A tall, lanky teenager with bright eyes and an easy smile, Isaiah's friend Tyler Evans, raised his hand. "Learn what? How to not arrest innocent kids at the mall?" Several kids snickered, and Frank felt his face grow hot. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus stepped in smoothly. "Tyler, we're all here to grow and learn from each other, Officer Marshall included." Frank watched as Isaiah and Tyler exchanged knowing looks. The dismissal in their eyes made his jaw clench. He'd faced hostile crowds before, but something about these teenagers' quiet disdain cut deeper than any shouted insult. Throughout the morning, Frank shadowed Marcus as he moved through the center. He watched as the commissioner helped a young girl with her math homework, played a quick game of basketball with some middle school boys, and mediated a dispute between two teenagers over computer time. Each interaction showed a side of police work Frank had never considered, one that had nothing to do with authority or force. But everywhere he went, Frank felt like an outsider. When he tried to join a conversation about sports, the kids found reasons to drift away. When he offered to help with an art project, the young artists suddenly decided they were finished. Even the staff members kept their interactions with him purely professional, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. Isaiah's presence made everything harder. The boy moved through the center like he owned it, clearly comfortable and well-liked. Other kids looked up to him, sought his opinion, laughed at his jokes. Frank couldn't help but compare this confident, popular young boy with the suspicious person he detained at the mall. The contrast made him deeply uncomfortable. "Officer Marshall," Marcus called, pulling Frank from his thoughts. "Come meet some of our regular volunteers. They run our afternoon tutoring program." As Frank followed Marcus, he caught Tyler's voice carrying across the room. "Bet he's taking notes on who to profile next." More snickers followed, and Frank's shoulders tensed. This was going to be a long 6 weeks. Frank Marshall stood near the snack area, watching the boys with wary eyes. Years of police work had trained him to look for trouble, and old habits died hard. When he noticed a group of teenagers, including Tyler Evans, huddled in an animated discussion, his police instincts kicked in immediately. Their voices were rising, hands moving expressively as they talked. Tyler gestured emphatically, making what Frank thought looked suspiciously like gang signs. Isaiah Carter stood among them, nodding intently at whatever Tyler was saying. Frank's heart rate quickened. He'd seen enough gang-related activities to recognize the signs, or so he thought. Without hesitating, he strode over to the group, his authoritative presence causing the teenagers to fall silent. "Break it up now," Frank commanded, falling back into his officer tone. "We don't allow gang-related activities here." The teenagers stared at him in disbelief. Tyler's face flushed red with embarrassment, while Isaiah's expression hardened into familiar disappointment. "Gang activities?" Tyler sputtered. "We were talking about basketball plays for the Youth League Championship. I was showing them our new offensive strategy." Isaiah shook his head slowly. "I'm team captain. Tyler's our point guard. We were discussing game plans for Saturday's final." The other teens shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding eye contact while others glared at Frank. The awkward silence spread through the recreation room as other kids stopped their activities to watch the scene unfold. "Officer Marshall." Marcus Carter's firm voice cut through the tension. He had approached quietly during the exchange, and his expression was carefully neutral. "A word, please." Frank followed Marcus to a quiet corner, his neck burning with embarrassment. He could hear the teenagers resuming their conversation behind him, their voices now deliberately lower and more restrained. "What did we discuss about observing and listening?" Marcus asked, his voice level but stern. "Those kids were having a perfectly normal conversation about their basketball team." Frank's defenses rose immediately. "With all due respect, sir, I saw what looked like gang signs." "Those were basketball plays," Marcus interrupted. "Tyler Evans has been the Youth League's star point guard for 2 years. He was using hand signals to explain court positions." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Not everything animated or passionate is a threat, Frank." "I was just trying to maintain order," Frank insisted, though his certainty was wavering. "By assuming the worst about these kids?" Marcus challenged. "The same way you assumed the worst about my son at the mall?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. Across the room, he could see Isaiah and Tyler huddled with their teammates, occasionally glancing his way. The excitement about their game strategy had been replaced with subdued frustration. "These kids come here to feel safe, to be themselves," Marcus continued. "Every time you jump to conclusions based on prejudice, you damage that safety. You make them feel like suspects in their own space." Frank wanted to argue, to defend his actions, but the evidence of his mistake was right in front of him. The basketball playbook Tyler had been holding was now visible on a nearby table, covered in X's and O's and arrows. Exactly what you'd expect from a team planning their championship strategy. "I know this isn't easy for you," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly. "But if you're going to learn anything from these 6 weeks, you need to start by questioning your own assumptions. Watch. Listen. These kids have a lot to teach you if you'll let them." Frank nodded stiffly, the weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. He watched. The luxury mall's grand atrium sparkled with elegant decorations and soft lighting. Frank Marshall tugged at his tie, feeling out of place among the well-dressed crowd of fundraiser attendees. The same mall where he'd wrongfully detained Isaiah Carter just weeks ago now felt like a stage for another kind of uncomfortable confrontation. Marcus Carter worked the room with natural ease, shaking hands and sharing warm smiles with potential donors. He wore an expertly tailored suit that commanded respect, while Isaiah stood nearby in a smart blazer, politely nodding at guests but keeping his distance from Frank. "The youth center does remarkable work," Marcus was saying to a cluster of wealthy donors. "We're seeing real changes in our community, thanks to programs like our championship basketball team." Frank hovered at the edges of these conversations, nursing a glass of water and observing. He noticed how some of the attendees' smiles didn't quite reach their eyes when Marcus spoke about the center's achievements. Isaiah moved between groups with practiced grace, though Frank could see the tension in the boys' shoulders whenever their paths crossed. The memory of their confrontation at the mall's entrance still hung heavy between them. "Of course we support community initiatives," a silver-haired man in an expensive suit said loudly enough for Frank to overhear. The man was speaking to another donor while gesturing with his champagne glass. "But you have to wonder about the quality of the youth they're bringing into this area." Frank's spine stiffened. The man continued in a lower voice. "I mean, just last month there was that incident with one of them trying to cause trouble here at the mall." Frank's face burned with shame, knowing he'd been the cause of that incident. He glanced at Isaiah, who was thankfully out of earshot, engaged in conversation with some of the mall staff who seemed genuinely interested in the youth center's programs. The silver-haired man's companion nodded sympathetically. "It's all well and good to help them, but we have to think about maintaining certain standards." Frank's hand tightened around his water glass. The casual cruelty in their words made his stomach turn. He recognized the same prejudices he'd acted on that day with Isaiah, now laid bare in the elegant phrases of these wealthy donors. The urge to speak up clawed at his throat, but fear kept him silent. What could he say? He'd been guilty of the same assumptions just weeks ago. Marcus approached the group, either unaware of or choosing to ignore their previous comments. "Gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying the evening. Have you had a chance to look at our presentation about the youth center's impact on academic achievement?" Frank watched as the men smoothly transitioned into polite smiles and diplomatic responses. Their earlier comments vanished beneath a veneer of civic responsibility. but Frank couldn't unhear them. He stood frozen, caught between his growing awareness of such prejudice and his inability to challenge it. Isaiah passed nearby, carrying a tray of programs to distribute. His eyes met Frank's briefly, and in that moment, Frank saw not the suspicious kid he'd profiled weeks ago, but a young man showing more poise and maturity than many of the adults in the room. The contrast between Isaiah's dignity and the donor's veiled contempt made Frank's silence feel even heavier. The evening continued around him, a swirl of sophisticated conversation and subtle prejudice. Frank remained quiet, struggling with his own cowardice, knowing that his silence made him complicit in the very attitudes he was supposedly learning to overcome. Isaiah found Frank standing alone near one of the marble pillars in the atrium. The boy's footsteps were deliberate as he approached, his young face set with determination. "I heard what those men said," Isaiah said quietly, his voice steady but lined with hurt. "And I saw you just standing there." Frank shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Isaiah's direct gaze. The water in his glass had long since grown warm, but he gripped it like a shield. "You're supposed to be learning, right?" Isaiah continued, his words carrying a weight beyond his years. "That's what my dad says, that you're here to understand and do better. But how is staying quiet when people say things like that doing better?" Frank's throat felt tight. The boy's words cut through his defenses with surgical precision. "It's complicated," he managed to say. "No, it's not," Isaiah countered, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. "You were brave enough to stop me at the mall entrance when you thought I was doing something wrong. But now, when someone's actually saying something wrong, you can't speak up?" Frank set his glass down on a nearby table, his hands suddenly feeling empty and useless. "I didn't want to cause a scene," he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "These people, they're important donors. More important than doing what's right?" Isaiah's question hung in the air between them. For the first time since their confrontation at the mall, Frank felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "I was scared," he confessed, the words barely above a whisper. "Not of them exactly, but of being that person. The one who makes waves." Isaiah's expression softened slightly, though his stance remained firm. "Being afraid isn't an excuse. You think I'm not scared sometimes? Every time I walk into this mall now I remember what happened. But I still come because hiding won't change anything." Frank finally met Isaiah's gaze, seeing not just anger there, but challenge. The boy was offering him something. Not forgiveness, not yet, but an opportunity. "If you really want to prove you're changing," Isaiah said, "then prove it. Don't just stand there next time. Do something." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of experience beyond his years. "Because staying quiet? That's just as bad as what you did to me at the mall. Maybe worse because now you know better." Across the room, Marcus was watching their interaction with careful attention, though he made no move to intervene. Frank could feel his supervisor's gaze, but for once it wasn't Marcus's judgment that weighed heaviest on him. "I'm not asking you to start a fight," Isaiah added, his voice softening slightly. "Just don't be a coward. That's the least you can do." The truth of Isaiah's words settled into Frank's chest, heavy and unavoidable. He'd spent weeks going through the motions of Marcus's community program, telling himself he was changing, but when the moment came to prove it, he'd failed. Just like at the mall, he'd chosen the easy path instead of the right one. Marcus sat at his kitchen table late that evening, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. The meeting with community leaders had been intense, their voices filled with justified anger and disappointment. "They think I'm being too soft," he told Angela, who placed a steaming mug of tea in front of him. "Reverend Thompson said I'm sending the wrong message by not making an example of Frank." Angela settled into the chair beside him, her warm hand finding his across the table. "And what does your heart tell you about this situation?" Marcus took a slow sip of tea, letting its warmth calm his nerves. "I see something in Frank that reminds me of my own father's journey. Dad was set in his ways too, but he changed when someone gave him a chance instead of shutting him out. "The community leaders aren't wrong to be angry," Angela said gently. "But they're not the ones who have to look Frank in the eye every day. You are. You see what they don't." Marcus nodded, thinking about the subtle changes he'd noticed in Frank over the past weeks. Today, when Isaiah confronted him about staying quiet during that racist comment, I saw something crack in Frank's armor. For the first time, he looked ashamed instead of defensive. Angela squeezed his hand. "Then trust that instinct, Marcus. You've always had a gift for seeing the best in people, even when they can't see it themselves." "But what if I'm wrong?" His voice carried the weight of doubt. "What if I'm letting everyone down? The community, Isaiah." "You're not letting anyone down by choosing hope over punishment," Angela assured him. "But maybe it's time to push Frank harder. If you see potential in him, don't let him hide from it." Marcus straightened in his chair, energy returning to his tired frame. "You're right. I've been too careful, worried about pushing him away. But real change doesn't come from staying comfortable." "That's the Marcus Carter I married," Angela smiled. "The man who believes in second chances but isn't afraid to demand better from people." Marcus pulled out his notebook and began jotting down ideas. "I'm going to have him lead some of the youth center activities instead of just observing. Make him face these kids as people, not statistics. And he needs to start having real conversations with the community members he's wronged." "That's going to make him uncomfortable," Angela observed. "Good," Marcus replied firmly, "because that's where growth happens, in the uncomfortable spaces we try to avoid." The morning sun beat down on the volunteers gathering for the community cleanup day. Frank stood near the supply table, watching Marcus organize teams of eager participants. The past few weeks of community service had left Frank feeling less like an outsider, though still not quite part of things. "We're running low on trash bags and gloves," Marcus announced, checking their inventory. "Frank, could you head over to Thompson's Hardware and pick up the donation they promised?" Frank nodded, grateful for a straightforward task. The bell chimed as he entered the store, where a clerk with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses stood behind the counter. "I'm here for the supplies for the community cleanup," Frank explained, showing his badge. "Should be under Commissioner Carter's name." The clerk's friendly expression soured. "Oh, that's for those kids from the youth center?" He shook his head. "Changed my mind about that donation. Last week, some teenagers were horsing around in here, knocking things over. Can't trust them." Frank felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same discomfort he'd felt at the fundraiser when he'd stayed silent. But this time, something was different. He thought of Isaiah's disappointed face, of all the kids he'd met at the youth center who were nothing like the clerk's assumptions. "Sir," Frank said, keeping his voice steady but firm, "I've spent the last few weeks working with those kids. They're good kids who are trying to make their community better." He leaned forward slightly. "And I used to think like you do, making assumptions about people before knowing them. I was wrong." The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "Well, You've seen what you expected to see," Frank interrupted, surprising himself with his conviction. "But I've watched these teenagers organize food drives, tutor younger kids, and show up early on Saturday mornings to clean up their neighborhood. They deserve better than being judged by stereotypes." Unknown to Frank, Isaiah had entered the store to grab some water bottles. He hung back near the entrance, watching the exchange with growing interest. The clerk's face reddened. I suppose I did promise the donation." "Yes, you did," Frank agreed. "And I think keeping that promise might show you what I've learned, that these kids deserve a chance to prove you wrong." The clerk hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Let me get those supplies from the back." As the clerk disappeared into the stockroom, Frank noticed Isaiah standing by the door. Their eyes met briefly, and though Isaiah didn't smile, his usual look of distrust had softened into something more contemplative. When Frank returned to the cleanup site with boxes of supplies, Marcus raised an eyebrow at his delayed return. "Everything okay at Thompson's?" "Just a misunderstanding that needed clearing up," Frank replied, unloading the boxes. Isaiah, who had returned before Frank, watched from nearby as he filled water bottles for the volunteers. His expression was guarded but thoughtful. remembering how the officer who had once profiled him had just stood up against the very kind of prejudice he himself had shown weeks ago. The youth center hummed with afternoon activity, as Frank stood before a group of teenagers seated in plastic chairs. After his moment at Thompson's Hardware, he'd felt more confident about speaking to the kids, but something still felt off in his delivery. "The key to success is discipline," Frank said, pacing in front of them. "Without structure and respect, you won't get anywhere in life. I've seen too many young people throw away their futures because they didn't learn these basic principles." Isaiah and Tyler exchanged glances from their seats in the back row. Tyler's jaw clenched as Frank continued. "Look at how you spend your time. Are you being productive? Are you showing proper respect to authority figures?" Frank's voice carried the same authoritative tone he used during traffic stops. "Many of you need to learn." "Learn what exactly?" Tyler stood up, his voice sharp with frustration. "How to be productive like you think we should be." Isaiah rose beside his friend. "You really think we don't know about hard work? Tyler here works 2 jobs after school to help his mom with bills. Most of us volunteer at the center when we could be hanging out instead." Frank's face reddened. "That's not what I—" "That's exactly what you meant," Isaiah cut in. "You're standing there acting like we're some project that needs fixing, like we don't already understand responsibility." "Watch your tone," Frank warned, falling back on his officer voice. "This is exactly the kind of disrespect—" "Disrespect?" Tyler stepped forward. "You want to talk about disrespect? How about assuming we're all just lazy kids who need your lecture on discipline? Man, I've been getting up at 5 a.m. for years to help at my uncle's store before school. What do you know about our lives?" The other teenagers murmured in agreement, and Frank felt the situation slipping away from him. "Now listen here." "No, you listen," Isaiah said, his voice steady but intense. "You come in here thinking you're going to teach us some grand lesson, but you haven't even bothered to learn who we are. That's not mentorship, that's just talking down to us." Marcus, who had been observing from the doorway, strode into the room. "Frank, a word." His voice carried a weight that silenced the brewing argument. In the hallway, Marcus fixed Frank with a disappointed stare. "What were you thinking? These kids don't need a lecture about discipline. They need someone to recognize their strength and potential." "I was trying to help," Frank protested, his defensive walls rising. "They need guidance." "They need respect," Marcus corrected firmly. "The same respect you'd want someone to show your own children. Instead of preaching at them, try listening to their stories first." Frank's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, pushing through the double doors into the afternoon sun. Behind him, he could hear Marcus calling his name, but he kept walking, his footsteps heavy with frustration. Frank sat in his parked patrol car, the engine off and darkness settling around him. The empty parking lot of the police station matched his mood, hollow and quiet. His father's voice echoed in his memory, as clear as if it were yesterday. "Never show weakness, boy," Richard Marshall had told him after Frank came home crying from a schoolyard fight. "The world eats up weak men. You stand your ground, you show them you're strong, and you never let them see you doubt yourself." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. For 30 years, he'd lived by those words. They'd shaped every interaction, every decision, every moment of his career. But now, sitting alone in the dark, he wondered if his father's lesson had been wrong all along. The next afternoon, Frank pulled into the youth center parking lot without being asked or scheduled. His steps were hesitant as he entered the building, finding his way to the art room where several kids were cleaning up after what looked like a painting session. Dried paint splattered the tables, and brushes soaked in murky water jars. Without a word, Frank removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and began gathering dirty brushes. The kids glanced at each other, uncertain, but continued their cleanup. He worked methodically, washing brushes at the sink, wiping down tables, and collecting scattered paper towels. From the doorway, Isaiah watched. He'd come to drop off some supplies and frozen at the sight of Officer Marshall quietly helping, his usual authoritative stance replaced by something softer, more humble. The officer's movements were careful, almost gentle as he helped a young girl clean dried paint off a pallet. Marcus observed from his office window. noting how Frank worked without trying to take charge or lecture anyone. It was the first time he'd seen the officer simply exist in the space without attempting to assert control. After about 20 minutes, Marcus walked down to the art room. "Frank," he called softly. "A moment?" Frank followed Marcus into the hallway, his shoulders tense as if expecting another reprimand. "Why did you come today?" Marcus asked. Frank stared at the floor for a long moment before answering. I just needed to be here, to help, without talking." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'm willing to give you another chance at this program." "But Frank?" He waited until the officer met his eyes. "You're running out of time to show real change. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Frank replied quietly, and for the first time there wasn't a trace of defensiveness in his voice. The community center's basketball court buzzed with energy as kids and teens played pickup games on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The squeak of sneakers and the thud of basketballs echoed through the space while parents and community members watched from the bleachers. Isaiah and Tyler sat with a group of older boys on the sidelines, taking a break after their game. They watched as Frank Marshall stood near the entrance, arms crossed, scanning the crowd with his usual stern expression. "Man, Officer Marshall looks like he's about to write the basketball a ticket for bouncing too loud," Tyler joked, making Isaiah snicker. "Yeah, he probably wants to search the ball for contraband," Isaiah added, and the group burst into laughter. Frank's head snapped toward the sound. His face flushed as he saw Isaiah and the others quickly looking away, still chuckling. The familiar burn of humiliation rose in his chest, reminding him of countless schoolyard moments when he'd been the outsider, the one others laughed at. Without thinking, Frank strode across the court, his footsteps heavy against the polished wood. The games paused as he approached Isaiah's group. "You think this is funny?" Frank demanded, his voice carrying across the now quiet gym. "You think it's appropriate to mock a police officer?" Isaiah's smile disappeared, replaced by a hard stare. "We were just joking around. Not everything is about you, Officer Marshall." "Really? Because it seems like you're making quite a habit of undermining my authority," Frank shot back, his voice rising. "First at the youth center, now here." The other boys shifted uncomfortably. Parents in the bleachers whispered among themselves. Isaiah stood up slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. "The only one undermining your authority is you," Isaiah said through gritted teeth. "You're proving exactly what I thought about you." He turned and stormed toward the exit, pushing past curious onlookers. Marcus Carter, who had witnessed the entire scene from the doorway, stepped forward. His expression was carved from stone as he approached Frank. "My office now," Marcus said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. In the privacy of Marcus's office, Frank stood at attention while Marcus sat behind his desk, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "What exactly did you hope to accomplish out there?" Marcus finally asked. "Sir, I was addressing a clear lack of respect." "No," Marcus cut him off. "You were letting your ego drive your actions. Again." Frank's jaw tightened. "They were mocking me." "They were being young kids, Frank, and instead of handling it like a professional, you created a scene that only damaged what little progress you've made." Marcus leaned forward. "Trust isn't demanded, Frank, it's earned, and right now you're moving backward." Frank felt the walls closing in. The isolation he'd been fighting against seemed more absolute than ever. "I'm trying," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Try harder," Marcus replied firmly, "because if you can't learn to control your reactions and earn the community's trust, there won't be any more chances." The evening sun cast long shadows through the Carter family's dining room windows as Marcus sat at the kitchen counter, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. Angela moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing dinner while casting concerned glances at her husband. "I don't know if I made the right call with Frank," Marcus finally said, breaking the silence. "Every time I think we're making progress, something happens that pushes Isaiah further away." Angela paused her cooking and turned to face him. "You're trying to help two people at once, honey. That's not easy." "But at what cost?" Marcus rubbed his temples. "Our son won't even look me in the eye anymore. He thinks I chose Frank over him." Have you asked Isaiah how he feels about the mentorship program? Angela asked gently, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Really asked him? Marcus looked up at her. What do you mean? Maybe instead of just telling him why you're doing this, you could involve him in the process. Angela sat beside him. He's 10, Marcus, but he's wise beyond his years. You know that. Let him have a voice in this. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both look up. Isaiah appeared in the doorway, his expression guarded as he saw his parents talking. Isaiah, Marcus called out, would you join us for dinner? Your mom made your favorite pasta. Isaiah hesitated but moved to the table. The family settled into their seats, the silence broken only by the quiet clink of silverware against plates. Son, Marcus started, I want to talk about Officer Marshall. There's nothing to talk about, Isaiah cut in, pushing his food around his plate. Please, Marcus said softly, I need you to understand why I'm doing this. Isaiah looked up, his eyes filled with hurt and frustration. Understand what? That you'd rather teach him how to be a better person than protect me? Isaiah, Angela began, but Isaiah continued. Do you know what it felt like, Dad? Standing there while he searched my backpack like I was some kind of criminal? And now I have to watch you take him under your wing like nothing happened. Marcus set down his fork, his heart aching. I'm trying to prevent what happened to you from happening to other kids. If we can change one officer's perspective. But what about my perspective? Isaiah's voice cracked slightly. What about how it feels to be a black young boy who can't even go to the mall without being harassed? Do you understand that? The question hung heavy in the air. Marcus looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not just his child but a young man grappling with realities that no black young boy should have to face. You're right, Marcus said quietly. I've been so focused on the bigger picture that I haven't properly acknowledged your pain. And I'm sorry for that. Angela reached across the table, touching Isaiah's hand. What if you had more say in how this mentorship program works? Your father values your insight, Isaiah. We both do. Isaiah pulled his hand back, but his expression softened slightly. How do I know anything will actually change? The next morning, Isaiah sat cross-legged on Tyler's bedroom floor, surrounded by poster boards and markers. We need to make them understand, he said, carefully writing "Justice for All" in bold letters. Tyler nodded, adding the finishing touches to his own sign. My cousin's coming with his friends too. That makes 20 people so far. What had started as a small idea between two friends had grown into something bigger. Local news stations had picked up on their social media posts about the protest, and more teens were joining their cause every day. At home, Marcus paced in his study, his phone buzzing with messages about Isaiah's planned protest. Pride and fear battled in his chest as he watched his son's movement gain momentum. When Angela brought him coffee, he shared his concerns. He's finding his voice, she reminded him gently. I know, Marcus sighed, but there are people who won't like what he has to say. The day of the protest arrived bright and clear. Isaiah and Tyler stood at the front of the growing crowd outside the police station, their signs held high. Frank Marshall watched from his patrol car across the street, his hands tight on the steering wheel. The crowd grew larger than expected. Parents joined their children. Community members showed up with water bottles and snacks. Local news vans parked nearby, cameras rolling. Frank noticed a man in the crowd getting agitated, his face red as he argued with the teenage protesters. Without thinking, Frank got out of his car and moved closer, keeping a watchful eye. Isaiah's voice rang out clear and strong through a megaphone. We deserve to feel safe in our own community. The angry man pushed forward suddenly, reaching for Isaiah's megaphone. Before anyone could react, Frank was there, positioning himself between Isaiah and the man. Sir, step back, Frank said firmly but calmly. These kids have a right to be here. Isaiah froze, megaphone still raised, watching Frank shield him from the aggressive bystander. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. Marcus, who had been monitoring the situation from nearby, moved through the crowd toward his son. He saw Frank's intervention but stayed back, watching as his officer handled the situation professionally and respectfully. The angry man backed down, muttering under his breath as he walked away. Frank remained nearby, quietly ensuring no other disturbances threatened the peaceful protest. As the afternoon continued, Isaiah led chants and shared stories, his voice growing stronger with each passing hour. Frank continued his subtle protection of the crowd, directing traffic and keeping troublemakers at bay. Tyler nudged Isaiah during a quiet moment. "Look who's actually doing his job right for once," he whispered, nodding toward Frank. Isaiah watched Frank from the corner of his eye, noting how the officer stood guard without trying to control or intimidate. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small shift in the right direction. The afternoon sun beat down on the youth center's parking lot as Isaiah walked home from basketball practice. He stopped short when he spotted Officer Frank Marshall bent over the engine of an old police cruiser, tools scattered around him. Isaiah hesitated, adjusting his backpack strap. He could easily walk the long way around, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the way Frank muttered to himself or how his usual stern demeanor seemed softer as he worked on the car. "Need any help?" Isaiah found himself asking, surprising them both. Frank straightened up, wiping his hands on an old rag. "Trying to get this old girl running again," he said, patting the cruiser's hood. The youth center could use a patrol car for demonstrations and community events. Isaiah moved closer, peering at the engine. "My uncle's a mechanic. He taught me a few things." Frank nodded, then fell quiet. The silence stretched between them until he spoke again, his voice different than Isaiah had ever heard it, less guarded, more human. "You know, when I was about your age, my father caught me playing basketball with some kids from the other side of town." Frank's hands fidgeted with the wrench. "He dragged me home, told me I was disgracing our family name." Isaiah watched Frank's face carefully, seeing something vulnerable there. "My whole life I was taught there was only one right way to be, one right way to think." Frank's voice grew quieter. "My father was the kind of man who, well, he wouldn't have liked the changes happening in this department." Isaiah leaned against the car's fender, listening. "I'm not saying this to excuse anything," Frank continued, meeting Isaiah's eyes. "But sometimes, when you're taught something your whole life, it becomes like breathing. And then one day you realize you've been breathing wrong all along." Frank picked up a socket wrench, turning it over in his hands. "Unlearning is harder than learning. Every day I catch myself thinking like my father, and I have to stop and ask myself why." Isaiah absorbed these words, feeling the weight of them. After a moment, he spoke softly. "It's not easy to change, but at least you're trying." Frank looked up, surprised by the simple kindness in those words. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was no tension, no anger, no fear, just understanding. Isaiah pushed himself off the fender and picked up a wrench. "So, want me to show you what my uncle taught me about carburetors?" The youth center buzzed with energy as Marcus Carter stood at the center of the gymnasium, clipboard in hand. "Welcome everyone to our first Community Challenge Day." His voice carried across the room, filled with excited kids and slightly nervous adults. Isaiah hung back near the basketball hoops, watching as his father explained the day's activities. The moment Marcus announced they'd be drawing random partners for the challenges, Isaiah's stomach dropped. "Isaiah Carter and—" Marcus paused, a slight smile playing at his lips. "Frank Marshall." The room fell quiet. Isaiah rolled his eyes while Frank shifted uncomfortably in his police uniform. They awkwardly made their way toward each other as other pairs formed around them. "First challenge, the community scavenger hunt," Marcus announced, handing out lists to each team. "You'll need to work together to solve riddles and find items around the youth center." Isaiah snatched the list from Frank's hands. "I know this place better than you do," he muttered. "Maybe we should read it together," Frank suggested stiffly. Their first riddle led them to the art room where they needed to find a specific paintbrush. Isaiah stormed ahead while Frank tried to keep up. "It says the brush that painted the mural outside," Frank read aloud. "I know what it says," Isaiah snapped, but then paused. "Wait. Which brush?" They stood there, surrounded by hundreds of paintbrushes, neither wanting to admit they needed help. Finally, Frank cleared his throat. "Maybe if we think about the size of the mural, Now, working together, they narrowed it down to the larger brushes. Isaiah spotted the paint-stained brush with a tagged handle. "There!" he exclaimed, reaching for it just as Frank did. Their hands bumped awkwardly, causing them both to jump back. To their surprise, they found themselves chuckling at the situation. As they progressed through the challenges, their coordination improved. Frank's attention to detail complemented Isaiah's knowledge of the center. During a puzzle challenge, Isaiah noticed Frank's hands shaking slightly as he tried to fit pieces together. "Here, let me help," Isaiah offered, demonstrating how to sort the edge pieces first. Frank watched, nodding appreciatively. Their breakthrough came during the final challenge, building a paper tower that could support a tennis ball. While other teams went for height, Frank suggested a wider base. Isaiah, remembering a science project, agreed. "If we fold the paper this way," Isaiah demonstrated, "it'll be stronger." Frank caught on quickly, and soon they were working in sync, passing papers and holding pieces in place without needing to speak. When their tower successfully held the tennis ball while others toppled, both of them broke into genuine smiles. "And the winners of the engineering challenge are Isaiah and Officer Marshall," Marcus announced, beaming at the unlikely duo. As they accepted their small trophy, Isaiah glanced at Frank. "Nice work with the base idea." "Nice work with the folding technique," Frank replied, a hint of warmth in his voice. The moment was small, but it felt significant, like a tiny crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable just hours before. Around them, the youth center erupted in applause, celebrating not just their victory, but perhaps something more meaningful: the sight of two people who had found a way to work together despite their differences. The community event continued into the afternoon, with parents and kids mingling in the youth center's main hall. Frank Marshall stood near the refreshment table, attempting to make small talk with some of the residents when Mr. Wilson, a vocal community elder known for his strong opinions, approached him. "I don't understand what Commissioner Carter is thinking," Mr. Wilson said loudly, drawing attention from nearby groups. His weathered face creased with disapproval as he looked Frank up and down. "Letting someone like you anywhere near these kids after what you did." The room grew quiet. Frank's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his hands clasped behind his back. "We all know what happened at the mall," Mr. Wilson continued, his voice rising. "How do we know this isn't just some PR stunt to save your job?" Frank opened his mouth to respond, but another voice cut through the tension first. "Because I've seen him change." Isaiah's words surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up from where he'd been sitting with Tyler, taking a few steps forward. "Mr. Wilson, I was the kid at the mall. I'm the one Officer Marshall stopped that day." Frank stared at Isaiah, his eyes wide with disbelief. "And yeah, what he did was wrong," Isaiah continued, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "But he's been showing up here every day, learning and trying to do better. That counts for something." Mr. Wilson shook his head. "Isaiah, you're too young to understand." "I understand plenty," Isaiah interrupted, politely but firmly. "I understand that people can change if we give them the chance to. Isn't that what we're supposed to be teaching here?" Marcus Carter watched from across the room, pride and surprise evident on his face. Before anyone could respond further, Isaiah turned and walked quickly toward the exit, uncomfortable with all the attention. He could hear the murmur of conversations resuming behind him as he pushed through the door. Later that evening, Isaiah sat on the steps of Tyler's front porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the quiet street. Tyler handed him a can of soda and settled down beside him. "I still can't believe you stood up for Officer Marshall," Tyler said, shaking his head. "That was unexpected." Isaiah stared at the unopened soda can in his hands. "Yeah, well, I surprised myself too." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "Remember when we were doing that scavenger hunt? There was this moment when he actually listened to my ideas. Not just pretending to listen, but really hearing what I had to say." Tyler nodded slowly. "But you still don't trust him completely?" "No," Isaiah admitted, finally opening his soda. "I mean, how can I? One good day doesn't erase everything else." He took a sip before continuing. "But I've been watching him, you know. The way he stopped himself from yelling at Kevin last week when the basketball almost hit him. The way he actually apologized to Mrs. Rodriguez for assuming she couldn't speak English. Small things, Tyler observed. Yeah, small things, Isaiah agreed. But they're real. It's like he's actually trying to learn from his mistakes instead of just saying sorry and moving on. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the distant sound of crickets filling the air. Still, Isaiah added, I'm not ready to be best friends or anything. I just couldn't let Mr. Wilson talk like that when I know Officer Marshall's been putting in the work. Tyler bumped his shoulder against Isaiah's. You're a better person than me. I would have let him squirm. Maybe, Isaiah smiled slightly. Or maybe I'm just tired of seeing people stuck in their ways, you know? Both the good and the bad. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Frank Marshall stood at the counter of Henderson's Hardware, his fingers drumming against the worn wooden surface. Mr. Henderson, a stocky man with thinning gray hair, shook his head for the third time. Look, Officer Marshall, I understand what you're trying to do here, but those kids from the youth center? Mr. Henderson trailed off, adjusting his glasses. Well, let's just say I've had some experiences with rowdy teenagers before. Frank felt his jaw tighten. 6 weeks ago, he might have nodded in agreement. Now, the words made his stomach turn. What experiences exactly? Frank asked, keeping his voice level. Because I spend time with these kids almost every day now. They're good kids who just need a chance. Mr. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Well, you know how they can be. Always hanging around in groups, being loud. Being teenagers? Frank finished for him, raising an eyebrow. The hardware store owner's face reddened. Listen, I just can't risk my supplies being misused or vandalized. That's final. Frank pulled out his wallet, removing his credit card. Then I'll buy them myself, the full list. Lumber, paint, brushes, everything. Mr. Henderson's eyes widened. That's got to be over $800 worth of supplies. I know exactly how much it is, Frank replied firmly, and it's worth every penny. As Mr. Henderson processed the transaction, Marcus Carter happened to walk by the store window. He paused, watching the interaction with interest through the glass. When Frank emerged with the receipt in hand, Marcus was waiting. That was quite a gesture, Marcus said, his usual stern expression softening slightly. Frank shrugged, trying to appear casual despite the pride he felt bubbling up inside. The center needs supplies. I had the means to help. $800 is a lot of money for a police officer's salary, Marcus observed. I've got savings, Frank replied. Besides, I usually spend my extra money on fancy coffee and takeout. This seems like a better investment. Marcus nodded slowly, a hint of approval in his eyes. The delivery truck will need help unloading when it arrives at the center later. I trust we'll see you there? Yes, sir, Frank answered, meaning it. Later that afternoon, Isaiah sat cross-legged on one of the youth center's worn couches, attempting to focus on his homework. Ms. Rodriguez, one of the center's staff members, was organizing art supplies nearby. Did you hear about Officer Marshall? She asked, sorting through paintbrushes. Isaiah looked up from his textbook. What about him? He bought all the renovation supplies himself after Henderson's wouldn't donate them, she explained, smiling. $800 worth. Wouldn't let anyone pay him back either. Isaiah set his pencil down, processing this information. He didn't mention anything about it. No, he wouldn't, Ms. Rodriguez replied. He seemed almost embarrassed when people thanked him. Isaiah leaned back against the couch, thinking about Frank Marshall's actions. It wasn't just the money, though that was significant. It was the fact that he'd done it quietly, without fanfare or expectation of praise. Isaiah remembered how different Frank had seemed that morning, helping unload supplies with his sleeves rolled up, joking with the other volunteers. Do you think he's really changed? Isaiah asked softly, more to himself than Ms. Rodriguez. She paused her sorting, considering the question. I think change is like building a house. It happens brick by brick, day by day. And sometimes the most important changes are the ones that happen so gradually you barely notice them until you step back and look at the whole picture. Isaiah nodded, his eyes drifting to the window where he could see the pile of lumber and supplies that would help transform their aging youth center. Each board and paintbrush represented more than just materials. They represented choice, action, and maybe even hope. Frank Marshall stood on the Carters' front porch, his hand frozen inches from the door. The warm glow from inside spilled onto the welcome mat, and the smell of home cooking wafted through the evening air. He adjusted his collar for the 10th time, feeling like a rookie on his first day at the academy. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Angela Carter's warm smile. "Frank, please come in. We've been expecting you." The Carter home was cozy and lived in, with family photos lining the walls and a worn but comfortable-looking couch in the living room. Isaiah sat at the dining table, his eyes fixed on his phone screen, barely glancing up as Frank entered. "Isaiah," Marcus called from the kitchen. "Put the phone away, it's dinner time." Isaiah sighed but complied, sliding the device into his pocket. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. "I hope you like pot roast," Angela said, gesturing for Frank to take a seat. "It's a family recipe." "Yes, ma'am," Frank replied, carefully settling into his chair. "Thank you for having me." The food was passed around, and for a few minutes the only sounds were the clinking of silverware and quiet requests to pass dishes. Angela's cooking was excellent, but Frank found it hard to focus on the taste. "The youth center renovation is coming along nicely," Marcus commented, breaking the silence. "Those supplies you bought have made a real difference." Isaiah pushed his carrots around his plate, but Frank noticed him listening intently. "The kids are doing most of the work," Frank said modestly. "I'm just there to help lift heavy things." "And to make sure we don't steal anything?" Isaiah muttered under his breath. "Isaiah," Angela warned, but Frank held up his hand. "No, it's okay," he said quietly. "I deserve that. I've been trying to prove that's not who I am anymore, but I understand why you're skeptical." The honesty in Frank's voice seemed to catch Isaiah off guard. He looked up from his plate for the first time that evening, studying Frank's face. Angela smiled gently and steered the conversation to lighter topics, asking about everyone's day and sharing funny stories from her work as a teacher. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere gradually softened, helped along by Angela's natural warmth and genuine interest in including everyone in the conversation. By the time Angela served dessert, a homemade apple pie, even Isaiah had contributed a few words to the discussion, though he still maintained his distance. As the evening drew to a close, Frank stood at the door, thanking the Carters for their hospitality. Isaiah lingered at the bottom of the stairs, hands stuffed in his pockets. "Hey," Isaiah called out just as Frank was about to leave. "I guess you're not as bad as I thought." "Sometimes." The words weren't exactly warm, but they weren't cold either. Frank nodded, understanding the olive branch for what it was. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The idea struck Isaiah during breakfast, making him nearly spill his orange juice. "Dad, what if we did something different at the mall?" Marcus looked up from his newspaper, eyebrows raised. "What do you mean, son?" "Remember the community challenge day? What if we flipped things around?" Isaiah's eyes lit up as he explained. "We could give kids from the youth center a VIP experience at that fancy mall, the same one where—" He trailed off, but Marcus understood the reference to the incident with Frank. "That's actually brilliant," Marcus said, setting down his paper. "It would change the whole narrative. Show everyone these kids belong there just as much as anyone else." Isaiah nodded eagerly. "We could do a special shopping trip, maybe even get some of the stores involved. Make them feel like real VIPs. Marcus watched his son with pride. This was exactly the kind of leadership he'd always known Isaiah possessed. "Why don't you take charge of this project? I'll support you however you need." "Really?" Isaiah's face broke into a wide smile before quickly falling again. "But how would we handle all the logistics? Security, store coordination, transportation?" "Well," Marcus said carefully, "Frank has experience with event security. He could help with the planning." Isaiah's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "Dad, just think about it," Marcus suggested. "He knows the mall security team, and he's been trying to make things right." The next day at the youth center, Isaiah reluctantly approached Frank, who was helping repaint one of the activity rooms. "Hey, Officer Marshall, got a minute? Frank set down his paint roller. Of course. Isaiah explained his idea, speaking quickly and formally like he was giving a presentation in class. When he finished, Frank was quiet for a moment. That's really something, Isaiah, Frank said softly. It would mean a lot to these kids, and it would send a powerful message to the community. Dad suggested you might help with the planning, Isaiah said, studying the floor, because of your experience with security and stuff. Frank nodded, careful to keep his voice neutral. I'd be honored to help. Whatever you need. They sat down at one of the youth center's worn tables, spreading out blank paper for planning. Isaiah started listing ideas while Frank took notes, occasionally offering practical suggestions about timing and logistics. We'll need to coordinate with at least 10 stores, Isaiah said, counting on his fingers, and figure out transportation. I know the mall's head of security, Frank offered, and the store managers association meets monthly. I could help set up a presentation. For the first time, Isaiah looked directly at Frank. You'd do that? Of course, Frank replied. This is your vision, Isaiah. I'm just here to help make it happen. They continued planning, the awkwardness gradually giving way to focused collaboration. When Marcus stopped by to check on their progress, he found them deep in discussion about permission slips and liability forms, Isaiah gesturing animatedly while Frank jotted down notes. We could get the local news involved, Isaiah was saying. Make it a big deal, show everyone these kids deserve to be there. Frank smiled slightly. Now that's thinking like a commissioner's son. Isaiah paused, then gave a small smile back. Well, someone once told me change has to start somewhere. The morning of the VIP mall event dawned bright and clear. Isaiah stood at the mall entrance, clipboard in hand, checking off names as excited kids from the youth center arrived in small groups. Frank Marshall stood nearby, coordinating with security teams through his radio. Everything was going smoothly until they reached Bellamy's, the mall's most exclusive boutique. The store manager, a thin man in an expensive suit, stepped forward with a forced smile. I'm sorry, but we have a strict policy about group tours, he said, glancing nervously at the children. Perhaps another store would be more appropriate? Isaiah's hands tightened on his clipboard, but before he could speak, Frank stepped forward. Mr. Reynolds, is it? Frank's voice was calm but carried authority. These children are VIP guests today with full clearance from mall management. Are you suggesting we've made a mistake in including your store? The manager shifted uncomfortably. Officer Marshall, you must understand our concerns about merchandise. These young people are here as valued customers, Frank continued, maintaining eye contact. Just like anyone else who walks through your doors. Now, will you be honoring the agreement your store made to participate in this event? After a tense moment, the manager stepped aside, mumbling apologies. As the kids filed in excitedly, Isaiah watched Frank with newfound respect. The day unfolded beautifully after that. Isaiah guided younger kids through the stores, helping them pick out special items with their gift cards. The private movie screening was a hit, with everyone enjoying unlimited popcorn and sodas. During a quiet moment while the younger kids were watching the movie, Isaiah approached Frank, who was standing near the theater entrance. That thing you did at Bellamy's, Isaiah started, then paused, searching for words. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Frank replied softly. Because it was right. Isaiah nodded slowly. I see it now, you know. How you're trying to change. Really trying, not just pretending. Frank turned to face him. The local news van pulled up to the youth center the morning after the mall event. Isaiah sat on the front steps, surrounded by excited kids who couldn't stop talking about their special day. A reporter with perfectly styled hair approached, microphone in hand. Isaiah Carter, you're the young man behind yesterday's successful mall initiative. How does it feel to make such a positive impact on your community? Isaiah shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the attention. It wasn't just me. The youth center staff worked really hard, and my dad, Commissioner Carter, helped make it happen. He glanced over at Frank Marshall, who stood quietly at the edge of the crowd. Officer Marshall helped too. He made sure everyone was treated fairly. The camera panned to Frank, who looked startled at the mention of his name. For once, he wasn't being portrayed as the villain in a news story. The feeling was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. Later that afternoon, Frank walked through the community park, where people had gathered to watch the news coverage on their phones. He caught snippets of conversation about the event, hearing his name mentioned with surprise rather than scorn. "Did you see Marshall standing up to that store manager?" one teenager said to another. "That was pretty cool." For the first time in weeks, Frank felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with embarrassment or anger. This was different. Pride, maybe. The feeling of finally doing something right. But then he overheard Mr. Wilson, the elderly resident who had questioned him before, talking to another neighbor on a nearby bench. "One good day at the mall doesn't erase years of profiling our kids," Mr. Wilson said firmly. "How many times did Marshall stop our boys for no reason? How many families felt unsafe because of him?" The words hit Frank like a physical blow. The pride he'd felt moments before crumbled, replaced by the familiar weight of guilt. Mr. Wilson was right. Could one good deed really make up for years of harmful actions? Isaiah, who had been walking home from his interview, noticed Frank's expression change. He watched as the officer's shoulders slumped, recognizing the look of someone wrestling with their past mistakes. "Hey, Officer Marshall," Isaiah called out, approaching him. "The kids are asking when you're coming back to help with the basketball tournament next week." Frank looked up, surprised by Isaiah's gesture. The boy's eyes held understanding beyond his years, as if he knew exactly what Frank needed to hear in that moment. "They want me there?" Frank asked quietly. "Yeah," Isaiah replied. "They do." The youth center buzzed with activity as kids played basketball and worked on art projects. Frank Marshall stood near the entrance, watching the scene with less tension in his shoulders than usual. The past few weeks had changed something in him, though he couldn't quite name what it was. Isaiah Carter approached, holding something behind his back. The boy who once looked at him with distrust now had a hint of a smile on his face. "Officer Marshall?" Isaiah pulled out a large, colorful card. "The kids and I made this for you." Frank took the card carefully as if it might break. The front featured a painting of the youth center with stick figures playing outside. Inside, dozens of signatures and doodles surrounded a message in Isaiah's neat handwriting. "Thanks for standing up for us when it mattered." Frank's throat tightened. His hands trembled slightly as he held the card, reading each signature. These were the same kids he'd once viewed with suspicion, the same community he'd kept at arm's length. Now they were thanking him. "I thank you," he managed to say, the words coming out stiff and awkward. He wanted to say more, to express how much this meant to him, but the emotions were too big, too unfamiliar. Isaiah nodded, understanding in his eyes before joining his friends at the basketball court. Later that afternoon, Frank found Marcus Carter in his office reviewing paperwork. "Commissioner," Frank said, closing the door behind him. "Do you have a minute?" Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. Frank sat down, still holding the card. "I'm starting to see things differently now," Frank admitted, his voice low. "The way I used to think. The things I did." He paused, struggling with the words. "But sometimes I wonder if it's too late. If I can ever really make up for all the damage I've done." Marcus leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Change isn't about erasing the past, Frank. It's about choosing a different path forward. Every day you make that choice is a day you help heal what was broken." Frank looked down at the card in his hands. "These kids, they're giving me a chance I'm not sure I deserve." "That's exactly why you deserve it," Marcus replied, "because you understand that now." Frank Marshall stared at the invitation letter on his desk, his stomach churning. The community forum was a big deal. Hundreds of people would attend. The thought of standing up there, talking about his mistakes and his journey made his hands shake. "I can't do this," he muttered, reaching for his phone to decline. "Can't do what?" Isaiah's voice made Frank jump. The boy stood in the doorway of the youth center office, curiosity on his face. Frank sighed, showing Isaiah the letter. "They want me to speak at the community forum next week. About everything that's happened." Isaiah picked up the letter, reading it carefully. "So why aren't you doing it?" "It's not that simple," Frank replied. running a hand through his hair. Getting up in front of all those people, talking about how wrong I was. You mean like how I had to stand up in front of everyone at the protest? Isaiah's voice was gentle but firm. If I can stand up for what I believe in, so can you. Frank looked at the young man before him, no longer the angry kid he'd wrongly accused months ago, but someone who'd shown him a better way. A week later, Frank stood behind the podium at the community center, his heart racing. The room was packed. He spotted Marcus Carter in the front row and beside him Isaiah, who gave him an encouraging nod. 6 months ago, Frank began, his voice shaky, I thought I knew everything about being a good police officer. I was wrong. He paused, taking a deep breath. I let my prejudices blind me. I hurt people, good people, because I couldn't see past my own biases. The room was silent as Frank continued, sharing stories about his transformation. He talked about the youth center, about learning to listen instead of judge. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about the kids who taught him more than he'd ever taught them. I'm still learning, he admitted, his eyes meeting Isaiah's. Every day I discover something new about myself, about this community, about what it really means to protect and serve. I'm not perfect, and I never will be. But I promise to keep trying, to keep growing, to be better tomorrow than I am today. When he finished, the silence lasted only a moment before someone started clapping. Then another person joined in, and another. Soon the whole room was on their feet. Through tears he couldn't quite hold back, Frank saw Isaiah standing and clapping, a proud smile on his face. The applause echoed through the room, but it was Isaiah's smile that meant the most. That smile told Frank everything he needed to know. He was finally on the right path. Frank Marshall leaned against the doorframe of the youth center's main room, watching Isaiah Carter with quiet admiration. The 10-year-old stood before a group of younger kids, his voice steady and confident as he spoke about standing up for what's right. Sometimes people might treat you unfairly, Isaiah said, looking at each child in turn. But that doesn't mean you stop being who you are. You stay strong, keep your head high, and prove them wrong with your actions. The children sat cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed in Isaiah's words. One little girl raised her hand. But what if we're scared? Isaiah's smile was gentle. Being scared is okay. I was scared too. But you know what? Being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid. It means doing what's right even when you are afraid. Frank felt a presence beside him and turned to see Marcus Carter. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Isaiah guide the younger kids through a role-playing exercise about handling difficult situations. He's something else, isn't he? Marcus said softly, pride evident in his voice. Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He really is. The way he connects with these kids, helps them understand. It's remarkable. You know, Marcus turned to face Frank. I want to thank you. Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. Thank me? For what? For being part of his journey. For being willing to change, to learn. It's given these kids, especially Isaiah, a powerful example of what's possible when people open their hearts to growth. Frank watched as Isaiah high-fived a young boy who'd just successfully worked through a challenging scenario. I think you've got that backwards, Commissioner, he said quietly. Isaiah's taught me more than I could ever teach anyone. He showed me what real courage looks like, what integrity means. He didn't just tell me I was wrong, he showed me a better way. Marcus smiled, placing a hand on Frank's shoulder. That's my boy, he said, his voice thick with emotion as they continued to watch Isaiah lead the group with wisdom beyond his years. The youth center buzzed with excited chatter as community members gathered to plan their next big event. The success of their recent initiatives had sparked a wave of enthusiasm throughout the neighborhood. In one corner, Frank Marshall sat with a group of local business owners, his notebook filled with ideas for upcoming programs. We could host a monthly market day, suggested Mrs. Thompson, who owned the local bookstore. Give the kids a chance to showcase their talents, maybe even sell some of their artwork. Frank nodded eagerly, a far cry from the rigid officer he'd been just months ago. The youth center's art program has really taken off. I bet Isaiah could help coordinate the young vendors. Across the room, Marcus Carter watched with quiet satisfaction as various groups brainstormed new ways to bring people together. The change in his community was palpable. Walls that had once divided them were slowly crumbling. "Dad!" Isaiah burst into the room, waving an envelope. "I got in. The Regional Youth Leadership Program. They accepted me." Marcus wrapped his son in a tight hug, his face beaming with pride. "I knew you would, son. You've shown everyone what real leadership looks like." The room erupted in applause and congratulations. Frank stood up, making his way over to Isaiah with a genuine smile. "Congratulations, kid. You've earned it." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Isaiah found Frank sitting alone on the youth center's front steps. The spring air was mild, and the setting sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks. "Mind if I join you?" Isaiah asked, settling down beside Frank without waiting for an answer. Frank chuckled. "Since when do you ask permission?" "True," Isaiah grinned. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but you're not half bad at this mentoring thing. You're like my second mentor now, after Dad, of course." Frank's eyes widened at the unexpected compliment. "Second mentor? That's quite a promotion from prejudiced officer who needs to check his bias." Isaiah laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet street. "Well, people can change. You taught me that, actually." He paused, kicking at a pebble on the step. "Even if you were pretty terrible at first." "Thanks, I think," Frank replied, but his smile was warm. The comfortable silence between them spoke volumes about how far they'd come. Inside, Marcus watched through the window as his son and Frank talked, their easy interaction a testament to the power of growth and understanding. The community's transformation had started with a single confrontation at a mall, but it had bloomed into something much more significant, a lesson in redemption, forgiveness, and the courage to change. Summer sunshine streamed through the youth center's windows as Frank Marshall helped a group of kids set up their art display. His movements were relaxed now, nothing like the stiff officer who had once patrolled these streets with suspicion in his eyes. A young girl tugged at his sleeve, proudly showing him her painting. "Look, Officer Frank, it's our community garden." Frank knelt down to admire the colorful artwork. "That's beautiful, Sophie. You captured everyone working together perfectly." Across town, Isaiah Carter stood at a podium, addressing a room full of community leaders as part of his youth leadership program. His voice carried with confidence as he presented his ideas for expanding youth involvement in local governance. "Our strength lies in understanding each other," Isaiah explained, his poise remarkable for someone so young. "When we give young people a voice, we build a stronger future for everyone." Marcus Carter watched from the back of the room, his chest swelling with pride. As police commissioner, he'd overseen many changes in the department, but nothing made him prouder than witnessing his son's growth into a community leader. Later that week, Isaiah approached Frank at the youth center holding an envelope. "Hey Frank, I've got something for you." He handed over the invitation with a slight smirk. "I'm presenting my final project for the leadership program next Thursday. You're part of this now, whether you like it or not." Frank took the envelope, touched by the gesture. "Wouldn't miss it, Isaiah." On the day of the presentation, Frank and Isaiah walked side by side toward the community center. The streets were alive with activity, kids playing basketball, elderly neighbors tending to community garden plots, and local business owners chatting with customers on the sidewalk. As they approached the entrance, Isaiah glanced at Frank. "You know, this whole thing started because you stopped me at that mall. Funny how things work out, right?" Frank nodded, understanding the weight of that moment and everything that had followed. Together, they walked into the building, joining a community that had learned to embrace change and growth, finding strength in their shared humanity. The room was packed with familiar faces, youth center kids, local business owners, and community leaders all gathered to support Isaiah. Marcus sat in the front row, sharing a proud smile with his son as the presentation began. If you enjoyed the story of Officer Frank, Isaiah, and Marcus, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.